They say you can never go home again. Not really. The house will be smaller, the streets narrower, the memories louder than the reality. But for Thomas, returning after 40 years wasn't about going home. It was about facing a ghost. A small, four-legged ghost with trusting eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. He hadn't planned to come back. A funeral for a forgotten aunt had forced his hand. But now, driving down these familiar roads, only one landmark mattered. One silent witness to a promise made by a boy and broken by a man. He believed his past was buried. He was wrong. He was about to learn that true loyalty doesn't know time, it doesn't know distance, it just knows how to wait. And sometimes it waits for generations. There are roads you travel only once, but spend a lifetime trying to forget. For Thomas, this quiet, unassuming street was one of them. 40 years, an entire life had been lived in the space between leaving and returning. He had built a career, raised a family, seen the world. He had meticulously constructed a new existence on top of the ruins of his childhood, hoping the weight of the present would be enough to silence the echoes of the past. It wasn't. A funeral for a forgotten aunt, a name on a sympathy card had been the unexpected summons, a duty call that had, against his will, pointed his car back to the one place on earth he had sworn never to see again. As he drove, a knot tightened in his stomach, cold and familiar. It was the ghost of a 10-year-old boy's grief, a grief so pure and absolute that even 40 years of adult life had failed to dilute its potency. He told himself he was just passing through. A quick visit to the cemetery, a polite nod to distant relatives, and then back to the safety of his well-ordered life. But he knew it was a lie. There was a pilgrimage he had to make, a final visit to a silent witness, not to seek forgiveness, but perhaps just to acknowledge the crime. And there it was, the old oak tree. It wasn't just a tree, it was a cathedral of memories, a silent giant at the end of the street. It seemed even larger and more gnarled than he remembered, its branches like ancient arms reaching out, holding secrets he had tried to abandon. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat against the quiet upholstery of the car. He had replayed this moment in his nightmares 1,000 times. The return, the reckoning. He opened the car door, and the air that hit him was thick with the scent of cut grass and damp earth, the exact same smell from 40 years ago. It was a sensory ambush. His legs felt like lead as he stepped onto the pavement, each movement a monumental effort against the pull of a past that refused to stay buried. Each step toward the tree was a step back through time. He could almost hear the high-pitched laughter of his younger self, a sound so clear it was painful. He could almost feel the rough, familiar bark under small, scraped hands. He could almost smell the distinct, comforting scent of summer rain on a dusty coat of fur. He stopped about 20 feet away, his throat closing up, a knot of unshed tears forming. And that's when he saw it. A detail his mind had refused to conjure in all its years of tortured recollection. Time stopped. It wasn't possible. It was a trick of the light, a hallucination born from guilt. 40 years. A dog's lifetime is a cruel, fleeting fraction of a man's, and yet the shape was unmistakable. The posture was a perfect echo. The old dog finally turned its head, its movements stiff with the arthritis of age. Its eyes, cloudy and blue-rimmed, met Thomas's, not with a spark of recognition, but with a deep, weary, almost philosophical curiosity. "Who are you, stranger, to disturb my watch?" But Thomas's gaze, drawn by an invisible string, drifted upward. to the branch just above the old dog's head, the lowest, thickest branch, the one a 10-year-old boy could just barely reach. And there, wrapped around the bark that had grown around it, weathered by 40 winters, bleached by 40 summers, so faded it was almost the same color of the wood, was a tattered, ghostly strip of cloth. The yellow ribbon. The promise. In that instant, the carefully constructed dam of 40 years shattered. The boy who left and the man who returned became one. The grief, the guilt, the love, the loss, it all came flooding back in a single, silent, gut-wrenching wave. The ghost wasn't just under the tree, it had been inside him all along, and it was finally time to let it speak. A promise is a fragile and sacred thing. For a 10-year-old boy, it is the most powerful currency in the world, a bond sealed not with ink, but with absolute, unwavering belief. In the long, hazy, sun-drenched summer of 1976, Thomas was the richest boy alive. His treasure wasn't measured in coins or comic books, but in the boundless, unconditional devotion of a scruffy, impossibly smart mutt named Buster. Buster was a creature of pure joy, a perfect blend of a dozen unknown breeds, resulting in a dog with the ears of a shepherd, the heart of a retriever, and the cunning intelligence of a survivor. He was a whirlwind of muddy paws, ecstatic barks, and a loyalty so fierce it felt like a physical presence, a warm, living shadow that followed Thomas everywhere he went. Their shared kingdom was the small, sleepy town, a world of cracked sidewalks that burned your bare feet in August, and the distant, hypnotic hum of lawnmowers on a Saturday morning. Their castle was a modest, single-story house with a perpetually squeaky screen door that slammed shut with a sound that, for Thomas, was the very definition of home. And their throne, their sacred meeting place, the epicenter of their universe, was the old oak tree. It was there that every grand adventure began, with Buster sniffing the air for imaginary dragons, and it was there that every adventure ended, with both boy and dog collapsing in the shade, exhausted and victorious. It was there they would lie for hours on blistering afternoons, Buster's heavy head resting comfortably on Thomas's small lap, the boy whispering all the secrets of the universe into the dog's attentive, twitching ears. He spoke of his dreams of becoming an astronaut, his fear of thunderstorms, his crush on the girl with the red bicycle. And Buster would listen with a profound, unwavering seriousness, his deep brown eyes never leaving the boy's face, as if he understood every word. His quiet presence a validation of all of the boy's dreams and all of his fears. One particularly golden afternoon, with the air thick with the smell of honeysuckle and the sky a perfect cloudless blue, Thomas was inspired. A song had been playing on the radio all summer, a story of a soldier, a long-awaited homecoming, and a yellow ribbon tied round the old oak tree. The melody and the sentiment captured the boy's imagination, and he decided to create his own version of that sacred vow. He found a strip of bright yellow cloth, torn from one of his mother's old aprons that she used for gardening, its fabric softened by years of use and smelling faintly of sunshine and soil. With Buster watching intently, his tail thumping a steady, hopeful rhythm against the gnarled roots of the tree, Thomas stood on his tiptoes, stretching his small frame to its absolute limit to reach the lowest, thickest branch. He wrapped the yellow ribbon around the rough bark, his small fingers fumbling with the knot, making it as tight as he possibly could. He stepped back to admire his work, his hands on his hips, a look of immense pride on his face. The yellow ribbon was a brilliant slash of color against the dark, ancient wood. "See this, Buster?" the boy said, his voice filled with the solemn, unshakable gravity that only a child can muster for such a sacred oath. This is our promise. This is for us. As long as this ribbon is here, it means I'll always come back, no matter what. If I go to school, I'll come back. If I go to my grandma's house, I'll come back. Even if I go to the moon, he declared, his imagination soaring, I'll find my way back. This tree will tell you I'm always, always coming back to you. Buster, of course, didn't understand the complex syntax of the promise, the abstract concept of always, but he understood something deeper. He understood the ritual. He understood the earnest, loving tone in his boy's voice. He understood the scent of his hands on the cloth and on the bark. He looked from the bright ribbon to the boy's shining face and back to the ribbon, and in his simple, profound canine mind, he forged an unbreakable connection. The ribbon, the tree, and Thomas were all one thing: home. The boy, in his innocent, heartfelt declaration, had no idea that this simple promise would one day become the heaviest burden of his life. He had no idea that his casual, absolute vow of no matter what was about to be put to the cruelest, most heartbreaking test imaginable. The end of that golden summer came not with the gentle turning of leaves, but with a sudden, chilling frost that had nothing to do with the weather. It began with hushed, worried conversations between his parents behind closed doors, voices tight with a tension Thomas had never heard before. Words like foreclosure, bankruptcy, and no choice drifted through the walls, heavy and sharp like shards of glass. His father, a man who had always seemed as strong and steady as the old oak tree itself, now moved through the house like a ghost, his face pale and his eyes hollowed out by a silent panic. His mother's smiles became brittle, fragile things that shattered the moment she thought no one was looking. Thomas didn't understand the financial complexities, but he understood the atmosphere. The air in their home, once light and full of laughter, had become thick and suffocating, heavy with unspoken fears. The packing began abruptly. Boxes appeared like strange brown invaders in every room. His mother would fold his clothes with a mechanical slowness, her gaze lost somewhere far away. When Thomas asked what was happening, the answers were vague and evasive. "We're going on a trip," his mother said, her voice thin, "a new adventure." But her eyes told a different story. They told a story of defeat. The day they left was a gray, overcast Tuesday. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath. The moving truck had already come and gone, leaving the house eerily empty, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of furniture and laughter. All that was left was the family car, packed to the ceiling with suitcases and boxes, a vessel for their retreat. Thomas knew, with the dreadful certainty of a child, that this was not a trip, this was an ending. His heart pounded with a single terrifying question, a question he was almost too afraid to ask. What about Buster? His father, who had been avoiding his gaze all morning, finally knelt down, his face a mask of strained composure. "Listen, son," he began, his voice rough. "Where we're going, it's a small apartment in the city. They don't allow dogs." The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. Thomas felt the world tilt on its axis. He looked from his father's pained face to Buster, who was sitting patiently by the door, his tail giving a few hopeful thumps, ready for the next adventure, oblivious to the fact that he was not invited. "No," Thomas whispered, the word a small, desperate plea. "No, we can't. I made a promise. The ribbon." He started to cry, hot, silent tears streaming down his face. "We can't leave him." His father pulled him into a rough, awkward hug. counterfeit coin compared to the pure gold of the one tied to the tree. The final moments were a blur of surreal, heartbreaking horror. His father clipped the leash onto Buster's collar and walked him to the old oak tree. Thomas watched from the car window, his body numb, a silent scream trapped in his chest. He saw his father tie the leash to the base of the tree, give Buster one last quick pat on the head, and then walk back to the car without looking back. Buster whined, a sound of pure confusion, and pulled against the leash, his eyes locked on the car. As the engine started, Thomas pressed his face against the cold glass of the rear window. The car pulled away from the curb, and the world he knew began to shrink. He saw Buster stand up, pulling harder, his body language a frantic question mark. "Where are you going? You forgot me." The car turned the corner at the end of the street, and for one last searing second, Thomas saw him, Buster, sitting under the old oak tree right below the bright yellow ribbon, a small, loyal figure watching his entire world drive away and disappear. Then he was gone. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the sound of his mother's muffled sobs and the quiet, rhythmic click of the turn signal ticking away the seconds of his new, empty life. Thomas didn't make a sound. He just stared out the window, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The image of the boy's best friend, abandoned beneath the tree of their sacred promise, burned into his memory forever. Time is supposed to be a healer, a gentle river that smooths the sharp edges of grief, washing away the pain until only a dull, distant ache remains. But for Thomas, time was a tormentor. It was an echo chamber, and the only sound it played back was the confused, heartbroken whine of a dog left behind. The image of Buster shrinking in the rearview mirror became the defining moment of his childhood, a wound so deep that it shaped the man he would become. He grew up with a hollow space inside him, a phantom limb where a wagging tail and a wet nose used to be. His teenage years were marked by a quiet, brooding melancholy. He was a good student, a responsible son, but there was a wall around him, a carefully constructed fortress to keep anyone from getting too close. He couldn't bear the thought of forming another bond that could be so brutally severed. When friends would get new puppies, he would find excuses to avoid visiting their homes. The sight of their innocent, clumsy joy, a painful reminder of his own profound loss. He would see people walking their dogs in the park and feel a sharp physical pang of jealousy and guilt, a toxic cocktail that churned in his stomach. The promise he had made, the yellow ribbon, became a symbol of his failure, a testament to his own powerlessness in the face of adult decisions. It taught him a cruel lesson at a young age. Promises, no matter how sacred, could be broken. He left for college and then built a career in a city far away, a landscape of concrete and steel that was the antithesis of his small green hometown. He married a kind woman, had 2 children of his own. His life, from the outside, was a picture of success, but his family always sensed a carefully guarded sadness in him, a locked room in his heart they were never allowed to enter. When his own children begged for a dog, he would always refuse, the excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It's too much work," he'd say. "The apartment is too small." But the real reason was a secret he kept locked away. He felt he didn't deserve the unconditional love of a dog. He had failed one so completely that he had forfeited the right to ever have another. Meanwhile, back in a town that time seemed to have forgotten, another life continued, governed by that same unbreakable promise. Buster waited. For 3 days and 3 nights, he stayed tethered to the oak tree, refusing the food and water offered by the concerned neighbors, the Hendersons. His eyes remained fixed on the road, a sentinel on a hopeless watch. Finally, driven by thirst and a deep instinctual need for survival, he allowed Mr. Henderson, the town's gentle, soft-spoken mailman, to unclip his leash. But he did not leave. He made the Hendersons' backyard his new base, but his soul remained at his post. Every single morning, as the sun rose, Buster would trot from the Hendersons' yard to the old oak tree and sit for an hour, watching the road. And every evening, as the sun set, he would do it again. It was a ritual, a prayer, a quiet act of faith. He became a local legend, the waiting dog. People in the town grew accustomed to the sight of him, a furry, four-legged monument to loyalty. He was a good dog, friendly to the children and a quiet companion to the Hendersons, but everyone knew that a part of him was not with them. A part of him was still in the summer of 1976, waiting for a boy who never came. Years passed. Buster's muzzle began to gray, his movements slowed, but his vigil never wavered. He was living out his life, holding up his end of a bargain, his existence a long, silent testament to a promise made with a yellow ribbon. The seasons turned and the world spun on, but under the old oak tree, time moved differently. It was measured not in days or years, but in sunrises and sunsets, each one marking another completed shift in Buster's unwavering vigil. The Henderson family who had taken him in loved him dearly. He was a gentle soul in their home, a warm presence at their feet in the evenings, a patient friend to their children as they grew. But they always understood that they only had a part of him. His heart, his true spiritual anchor, was rooted to that spot at the end of the street, bound by an invisible tether of memory. As Buster aged, his golden brown coat became threaded with silver. His once bright eyes grew cloudy with a gentle blue haze, and a noble stiffness entered his gait. The morning and evening trots to the oak tree became slower, more deliberate walks. He would lie in the shade for longer periods, his breathing heavier, his dreams filled with the phantom scent of a 10-year-old boy. The townspeople who had watched him grow old treated him with a quiet reverence. He was more than just a dog. He was a landmark, a living piece of local folklore, a furry embodiment of a love that refused to surrender to the logic of time. One crisp autumn evening, when Buster was very, very old, he made his final journey to the tree. He lay down in his usual spot, resting his graying head on his paws. He looked down the road one last time as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He let out a soft, contented sigh, a sound of a duty fulfilled, and closed his eyes. He had held up his end of the promise for as long as his loyal heart could beat. The next morning, Mr. Henderson found him there, peaceful under the branches, having passed away in the place that mattered most. The watch was over. But the story did not end there. Buster, in his years with the Hendersons and his quiet wanderings through the neighborhood, had left behind more than just a memory. He had left behind a legacy. A few years before he passed, a stray female dog had wandered into town, and for a brief season, she and the old, loyal Buster had been companions. From that union, a litter of puppies was born, all with their father's scruffy coat and intelligent eyes. Most were given away to families in neighboring towns, but one, a small male who looked almost identical to how Buster had as a pup, was kept by the Hendersons' newly married daughter, who now lived just a few houses down from her parents. This new pup, named Rusty, seemed to inherit his father's soul. From the moment he was old enough to explore, he was inexplicably drawn to the old oak tree. He would sit in the same spot, sniff the same roots, and watch the same road. It was a behavior no one had taught him. It was an instinct, a genetic memory, a spiritual inheritance passed down. When Rusty grew old and had pups of his own, one of them carried on the tradition. And so it went, a silent, unbroken dynasty of loyalty. The dogs were not tethered, they were not trained, they simply knew. They were the keepers of the watch, the guardians of a promise they didn't understand but felt in their very bones. They were the living echoes of Buster's unwavering faith, each generation a new verse in a long, silent song of devotion, waiting for a man who had no idea that his promise was still being honored. 40 years is a lifetime. For Thomas, it was the length of time it took to build a fortress around his heart. He had become a master of avoidance, an architect of emotional distance. His life in the bustling, anonymous city was a carefully curated ecosystem, devoid of the triggers of his past. He never subscribed to hometown newspapers. He actively avoided conversations about childhood pets, and he navigated the world with a quiet, unshakable resolve to never look back. The memory of Buster was a locked box in the attic of his mind, and he had no intention of ever finding the key. The summons came in the most mundane of forms, a cream-colored envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front was vaguely familiar, a spidery script from a distant past. It was from a cousin he hadn't seen since he was a child, informing him of the passing of his great-aunt Mildred. The news itself barely registered. She was a peripheral figure in his life, a face and a handful of faded family photographs. But a single line at the bottom of the letter acted as a summons he could not ignore. The service will be held at St. James Chapel, back home. Back home. 2 words he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate in 4 decades. His first instinct was to refuse. He could send flowers, a sympathy card, a check. He had a demanding job, meetings he couldn't possibly miss. The excuses formed easily on his tongue, practiced and polished from years of use. But as he stood in his modern, minimalist kitchen, staring at the letter, he felt a strange, unfamiliar pull. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier, like the slow, inexorable pull of a tide. His wife, noticing the strange, haunted look on his face, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Maybe you should go," she said softly. "Maybe it's time." The long drive was a journey through a foreign country that was once his own. The highways and cities of his adult life slowly gave way to winding country roads and familiar green landscapes. With every mile that brought him closer to his hometown, the walls of his fortress began to crumble. Memories he had suppressed for decades began to seep through the cracks. The taste of wild blackberries picked from a bush behind his old school. The feeling of the splintery wood of the bleachers at the local baseball field. And, most vividly, the feeling of a small, warm body curled up next to him in bed on a cold night. He attended the funeral in a daze, shaking hands with relatives who were now strangers, their faces a strange collage of his own features aged by time. He listened to the eulogies, offered his condolences, and played the part of the dutiful nephew. But his mind was elsewhere. As soon as the service was over and the polite, somber reception began, he slipped out unnoticed. He got into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He knew he couldn't leave, not yet. The pilgrimage he had been avoiding his entire life was now inevitable. He drove not towards the highway that would take him back to his safe, curated existence, but in the opposite direction, towards the old part of town, towards the street, his street. His heart pounded a frantic, suffocating rhythm in his chest. He was no longer a successful 50-year-old man. He was a terrified 10-year-old boy trapped in the back of a car, watching his whole world disappear in the rearview mirror. He was an unwilling pilgrim, finally returning to the scene of his greatest sin, drawn by a force he no longer had the strength to fight. He parked the car at the curb, the same spot where his family's overloaded sedan had stood 4 decades earlier. The engine died, and a profound silence rushed in, a silence so deep it seemed to have a weight pressing down on him. Through the windshield, he saw it, the old oak tree. It stood as a silent, gnarled sentinel at the end of the street, a living monument that had witnessed the entirety of his life, from the boundless joy of his youth to the crushing grief of his departure, and now the hollow ache of his return. Its branches, thicker and more sprawling than he remembered, seemed to sag with the weight of all the seasons they had endured, all the secrets they had kept. With a deep, shuddering breath, he opened the car door. The air that greeted him was a potent cocktail of memory, thick with the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, a smell so intrinsically linked to his childhood that it felt like a physical blow. His legs felt heavy, disconnected from his body as he forced himself to step onto the pavement. Each step toward the tree was a reluctant pilgrimage, a walk through a gallery of ghosts. He saw the ghost of his 10-year-old self, laughing, his face bright with a light that had long since been extinguished. He saw the ghost of Buster, a blur of joyful energy, chasing a red rubber ball across the lawn. The memories were so vivid, so visceral, that he could almost feel the rough bark of the tree under his small, scraped hands. He stopped about 20 feet away, a safe distance, as if the tree itself radiated a field of sorrow he was afraid to enter. His throat was tight, his eyes burning with tears he had refused to shed for 40 years, and it was then, as his eyes adjusted to the scene, that he saw it. A shape, a form at the base of the tree. His mind, conditioned by decades of guilt, initially refused to process it. It was a trick of the light, a cruel mirage conjured by a heart heavy with regret. But the shape moved. It shifted its weight, and the illusion solidified into a stark, unbelievable reality. It was a dog. An old, scruffy mutt, its coat a patchwork of gray and faded brown, its body carrying the weary stillness of great age. It was sitting in the exact spot his memory held sacred, its posture a perfect, heartbreaking echo of Buster's. The dog wasn't looking at him, it was looking down the long, empty road, a sentinel on a watch that seemed to have no end. Time itself seemed to bend and warp around the scene. For a dizzying moment, Thomas felt as if no time had passed at all, that he was still 10 years old, and that this was Buster, having waited for him all this time. The old dog, sensing his presence, finally turned its head. The movement was slow, stiff with the arthritis of a long life. Its eyes, cloudy and rimmed with the pale blue of age, met Thomas's. There was no spark of recognition, no joyful bark. There was only a deep, soulful, and profoundly weary curiosity, a quiet dignity. Who are you, stranger, to disturb this sacred ground? But Thomas's gaze was pulled away from the dog's ancient eyes, drawn by an invisible string to the branch just above its head, the lowest, thickest branch, the one a small boy could just barely reach. And there, so weathered and faded that it was almost indistinguishable from the bark, its fibers woven into the very wood of the tree that had grown around it, was a tattered, ghostly strip of cloth, the yellow ribbon, the promise, still there after all this time. The sight of it shattered the last of his defenses. A sound, a choked, guttural sob escaped his lips. The carefully constructed dam of 40 years didn't just break, it exploded. The grief, the guilt, the love, the loss, it all came flooding back in a single, silent, overwhelming wave. He saw not just an old dog, but the ghost of Buster, and the ghost of Buster's son, and his son after him. He saw an unbroken line, a dynasty of loyalty, a silent vigil passed down through generations, all waiting for him. The echo of his promise, kept not by the boy who made it, but by the descendants of the one who had received it. The sob that tore from Thomas's throat was the sound of a wound that had been festering for 40 years, finally being lanced. It was the sound of pure, undiluted anguish, a sound that carried the weight of every day he had lived with the ghost of his failure. His legs gave way, and he sank to his knees on the damp grass, the carefully maintained composure of his adult life dissolving into the raw, helpless grief of the 10-year-old boy he had been. He buried his face in his hands, and the tears he had held back for a lifetime came in a hot, cleansing flood. He wept for the boy he was, for the promise he had broken, and for the loyal friend he had abandoned. He wept for the years of guilt that had poisoned his relationships and hollowed out his joy. He wept for the impossible, staggering beauty of a loyalty that had outlived the one to whom it had been pledged. The old dog, startled by the sudden outburst of emotion, had initially tensed, a low, uncertain growl rumbling in its chest. It had seen many things in its long life from its post under the tree, but it had never witnessed a sight like this, a grown man weeping uncontrollably on the ground. It watched him for a long moment, its head cocked, its ancient eyes trying to decipher the scene. There was no threat in the man's posture, only a profound and overwhelming sadness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to radiate from him in waves. The dog's instincts, honed by generations of empathy, took over. The low growl subsided, replaced by a soft, questioning whine. Slowly, stiffly, the old dog rose to its feet. It took a hesitant step toward Thomas, then another. It moved with the cautious, deliberate pace of old age, its claws making soft sounds in the grass. It stopped just a few feet from the kneeling man, sniffing the air, its sensitive nose trying to read the story of his pain. Then, with a final, trusting decision, it closed the remaining distance. Thomas, his face still buried in his hands, felt a sudden, gentle pressure against his arm. He flinched, then slowly lowered his hands. The old dog was standing beside him, its head lowered, nudging his hand with its wet nose. It looked up at him, and in its cloudy, cataract-filled eyes, Thomas saw not just the echo of Buster, but a deep, calming wisdom of its own. It was a look of pure, uncomplicated acceptance. There was no judgment, no accusation. There was only a quiet, comforting presence. The dog let out a soft sigh, as if to say, "It's all right. I'm here now." Of its own accord, Thomas's trembling hand rose and rested on the dog's head. The fur was coarse and thick, but beneath it he could feel the familiar, solid warmth of a living, breathing being. He stroked the dog's head, his fingers tracing the bony ridges, feeling the soft velvet of its ears. The dog leaned into his touch, closing its eyes in contentment. In that simple, profound moment of connection, the circle of 40 years began to close. The man was no longer just a man, and the dog was no longer just a dog. They were the beginning and the end of a long, silent story, two souls linked by a tattered yellow ribbon and a promise that had, against all odds, finally been kept. Thomas wasn't just petting a dog, he was forgiving himself. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the damp grass under the ancient boughs of the oak tree as the sun bled across the horizon. The world around them, with its passing cars and distant sounds of life, seemed to fade into an insignificant blur. Their reality had shrunk to that small, sacred patch of ground. Thomas continued to stroke the old dog's head, the repetitive tactile motion a soothing balm to his raw emotions. The tears had subsided, replaced by a profound, quiet sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing his entire adult life. It was the feeling of a heavy, invisible weight being lifted from his soul, a weight he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The old dog, for its part, seemed to have accepted this strange, sad man as part of the landscape. It stood patiently by his side, leaning into his touch, offering a silent, unwavering companionship that felt as ancient as the tree itself. It was as if this moment was what its entire lineage had been waiting for, the final, closing chapter of a story passed down through blood and bone. The watch was finally, truly over. As darkness began to settle, a new clarity dawned in Thomas's mind. It was a clarity born from emotional exhaustion and a sudden, startling sense of purpose. He knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of his being, what he had to do. This couldn't be just a fleeting moment of catharsis. It had to be a permanent change, a real fulfillment. He rose to his feet slowly, his joints stiff. The old dog looked up at him, a questioning look in its tired eyes. Thomas smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Okay, old friend," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I think it's time we both went home." He walked back to his car, and the dog, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. It didn't run, it didn't bound, it just walked with a steady, trusting gait, its place now beside this man who had appeared out of the past. Thomas opened the back door of his modern, clean car, a car that had never known the scent of a dog, and laid down a protective blanket he found in the trunk. "Come on," he said gently. The old dog sniffed the entrance, then with a small leap of faith, hopped inside and settled down with a contented sigh. Thomas didn't drive back to the hotel where he was supposed to be staying. He didn't call his wife to tell her he was okay. He just started driving, heading for the highway, away from his hometown. But this time, he wasn't running away from it. He was taking the most important part of it with him. He glanced in the rearview mirror. It was the same mirror through which he had watched his world disappear 40 years ago. But now, instead of an image of abandonment, it held an image of rescue. The old dog was curled up on the back seat, its eyes closed, already asleep, already trusting. In that moment, Thomas made a new promise, not a childish one sworn on a ribbon, but a man's vow, silent and absolute. He would give this dog, this living echo of his past, the best final years of its life. He would give it a warm bed, good food, and all the love and affection that had been dammed up inside him for 4 decades. He was finally keeping his promise. He was taking Buster home. The journey back to the city was the mirror image of the one that had brought him there. The heavy, suffocating silence of his arrival was replaced by a quiet, peaceful companionship. The old dog, whom Thomas had decided to name Echo, slept for most of the ride, a silent, furry passenger whose very presence seemed to heal the 40-year-old wound in Thomas's soul. When he finally arrived home late that night, his wife met him at the door, her face a mixture of worry and confusion. But then she saw the old, tired dog standing faithfully by Thomas's side, and she saw the look on her husband's face, a look of profound, unburdened peace she had never seen before, and she understood completely. Echo's final years were a gentle, golden epilogue to a long life of waiting. He, who had known only a yard and the ground beneath an oak tree, discovered the unimaginable comfort of a soft dog bed, the quiet dignity of having his own water bowl, and the pure bliss of sleeping at the foot of his person's bed. He was a ghost who had finally found his haunting ground. His movements were slow, his energy was low, but his capacity for quiet affection was infinite. He would follow Thomas from room to room, not with the frantic energy of a puppy, but with the serene gravity of a shadow that had finally found its rightful owner. For Thomas, Echo's presence was a constant, gentle reminder of the grace he had been given. He learned the rhythms of the old dog's life, the slow, deliberate walks in the park, the long afternoon naps in a patch of sunlight on the living room floor, the soft, contented sighs in the quiet of the evening. He found a joy he never thought possible in the simple act of caring for this creature, in brushing his matted fur, in feeding him his favorite soft food, in simply sitting with him, his hand resting on the dog's warm, sleeping body. He was not just caring for Echo, he was retroactively caring for Buster. He was healing the boy inside him one gentle pat at a time. His own children, now grown, watched the transformation in their father with a sense of wonder, finally understanding the source of the secret sadness he had carried for so long. Echo lived for 2 more years, 2 years of quiet, unconditional love and peaceful companionship. He had fulfilled his inherited destiny. He had closed the circle. One morning, he simply didn't wake up, passing away peacefully in his sleep, in his warm bed, in a safe home, with his person nearby. The watch was, at long last, truly and finally over.
The grief Thomas felt was deep and real, but it was a clean, healthy sorrow, worlds away from the toxic guilt that had haunted him for decades. It was the noble grief for a life well lived and a love fully expressed. He buried Echo in a quiet corner of a sun-dappled garden, a place of peace. A week later, Thomas made one last trip back to his hometown. He drove directly to the end of the street and parked his car. He walked to the old oak tree, his steps now light and sure. He reached up to the lowest branch, and with gentle, reverent fingers, he untied the tattered, ghostly remains of the yellow ribbon. It had been there for over 40 years, a symbol of a broken promise and a miraculous, enduring loyalty. He held the fragile strip of cloth in his hand, a sacred relic. He didn't tie a new ribbon. There was no need. The promise had been fulfilled. The debt had been paid. He looked at the old oak tree, no longer a monument to his failure, but a testament to a love that could be passed down like a torch through generations. He had learned that some promises are so powerful they create their own echoes, and that true loyalty doesn't just wait, it endures, it adapts, and sometimes, against all odds, it finds its way home. As he walked back to his car, the old faded ribbon clutched in his hand, Thomas finally felt free. The ghost was gone. All that remained was the love. The story of Thomas and Buster and his echo reminds us that the deepest connections we make often leave an imprint that transcends time itself. It shows us that loyalty isn't just an action, but can be a legacy passed down in ways we may never fully understand.
It's a testament to the silent, unbreakable vows made between humans and the incredible animals who share our lives. Thank you for joining us on this journey here at the Silent Cord. We believe that in every bark, in every wagging tail, and in every quiet, knowing look, there is a story waiting to be told. These are the stories that remind us of the best parts of ourselves. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever felt a connection with an animal that seemed to span across time? There are so many more chords to be struck and stories to be shared. We'll see you in the next one.